He didn't as much wake as he was roughly woken up. The world flipped. Something gave way beneath him, and although his instincts saw him landing in a crouch with his eyes wild, it still didn't stop his feet being tangled in the blankets, dragging him to the floor. "Wake up!" a feminine voice growled, tearing the blankets off him as he looked up towards a blonde figure above him. His immediate thought was Yang, because really, who else would feel the need to wake him up by literally flipping the mattress? But the sudden recollection of where he was quashed that thought immediately. Yang was dead. No. Well, alive. She was alive. But she was at patch with RWBY, or Signal, depending whether this was term time or not really. The girl above him was blonde, however, and had purple eyes just like Yang, though maybe a few shades darker. Her blonde hair was tied into a short ponytail, however, something he doubted the bombastic brawler would ever entertain the thought of. "Why are you looking at me so stupid, bonehead?" the girl sighed, throwing a pair of jeans at his face. Ah, of course. This was one of his sisters. Jade? You're blind as well as stupid, it seems. It's Hazel. Jade gave up on waking you like half an hour ago. Hazel crossed her arms beneath her budding breasts, making sure he could see just how unimpressed she was at being called up. Right, Hazel. She was a little older than him, if he recalled. Sorry. He stumbled till he was dressed to try and find a shirt. I was tired. He took a moment to look at the mess across the floor, now including a mattress and 2 pillows. Couldn't you have just shaken me awake? Are you joking? The girl laughed, though it was less in genuine amusement than to drive a point home. We tried that, 2 hours ago? Everyone has tried. You just slept through everything. Was that so? Maybe it was his body's way of trying to catch up with all the sleep he'd missed? Well, his mind's way. His body was actually fairly fresh. Sorry. It was easier to give in than argue the fact. How long have I been asleep for then? Last thing I remember was breakfast, and his stomach was giving him painful reminders about that broken promise. Yeah, well, Mum said you fell asleep at the table, so she carried you back to your room. It's been like maybe 6 hours since then? It's gone noon. The girl rolled her eyes before leaning in with a leer on her face. What were you doing that got you so tired, Gianni? Were you giving yourself a good clean? Polishing your rocket, maybe? Hilarious. He deadpanned, pulling off his top and pulling the white shirt on. His sister turned away the moment he started getting changed, making a disgusted noise as she sidestepped towards the door. Yeah, well, don't forget we're off to the lake today, so make sure you bring something to swim in. The door slammed shut as he pulled his trousers down, before a moment later opening back up. And a towel. Ew, my eyes. I'm scarred. He rolled his eyes and buttoned the trousers, even as he faintly heard her shouting about having seen his bum or something. What a weird family. A trip to the lake though? That didn't stir any memories, though that didn't mean much. Maybe it had been boring in his first life, or just something he did every now and then. It didn't really matter since he had to wait for Kuroka Malls anyway. He might as well go along for whatever they said. Another yawn escaped him as he leaned down to put some shoes on. Gods, he was still so tired. He did vaguely look back to his sheets, eyes heavy as he considered them, before a thumping through the floor caught his attention. It sounded like someone smacking an object against the ceiling below. I'm coming, he shouted, as he rolled his eyes and staggered towards the door. Sheesh. The whole family was waiting downstairs, or rather, the female side of it, which did make up 80% of the Ark household. Not a one of them had a hair colour other than blonde, no doubt an offshoot of 2 blonde parents, though maybe 1 or 2 had lightly dyed parts. A desperate attempt for individuality in a family, for the most parts, looked quite similar. He could only remember a few names off the top of his head. The youngest Amber, memorable mainly because she was so small, somewhere between the ages of 10 and 12, he supposed. There was Hazel, of course, and her twin sister Jade, who she was now talking to. Other than that, he could just recall a few names. Coral, Sable, Saffron? Jean didn't get a chance to consider the rest. From the moment he entered the room, a pack was thrust into his arms. His mother saying something about looking after it, before she started distributing baskets to the girls. A few moments later and they were turfed out of the house and trekking through the nearby woods. Juniper Ark watched her children play with a fond smile. This was her family now, one she had made with Nikki, and that she had raised from childhood to where they were now. Little family outings like the monthly trip to the lake were the norm. Little things to help build solidarity in a house with so many people. It could be tough sometimes, especially when the kids wanted to have a bit of peace and quiet, or when she and her man wanted to have some time to themselves. Tempers would inevitably fray, and it wasn't unusual for her to be stuck prying girls from one another, making sure they stopped pulling on each other's hair. If it wasn't one thing, it was always another. "Mummy," a little voice cut into her thoughts, a figure climbing into her lap with no regard for the sandwich she was trying to eat. Juniper simply chuckled, putting the treat down on a nearby container as she helped to sit Amber up, stroking the back of her short hair. A pair of baby blue eyes looked up towards her, lighter than her husband's but beautiful nonetheless. "What's wrong, baby?" She didn't think there'd been any fights yet. Coral and Lavender were sunbathing near the trees. Jade, Hazel and Sybil were in the water having fun, and Sapphire was reading with her feet dipping into the lake. "Mummy, why is Big Brother still sleeping?" "He was?" Green eyes trailed across the surface of the lake in the direction her youngest was pointing to eventually come to rest upon her one and only son. Jean sat with his back against the bark of the tree, eyes closed and chest rising and falling with each breath. She had no idea how he could find that position comfortable, but Amber was right. He was asleep. Again. "I think he's just tired, sweetie." She pressed a kiss to the top of Amber's hair, giggling lightly at the affronted look the girl gave. He had seemed tired that morning, but then again, he'd woken up early too. On most weekends he'd sleep until the crack of noon anyway, so maybe he was just making up for lost time now. She hoped he wasn't coming down with anything. He just hadn't seemed right earlier. She wished Nikki was here. He'd be able to help, maybe tell her if she was just panicking about things. He was 14 after all. Puberty and teenage years could change a man, but that look in his eyes, that was one she knew she'd seen before. He'd inherited so much from both of them. It made sense that he would have that same expression Nikki sometimes did. The look that said the mission hadn't gone as well as hoped. That he'd seen things and wanted desperately to forget them. Being married to a hunter, you had to get used to those things. That sometimes the man or woman you loved would come back somehow less whole than they'd left. "You're imagining things," she rebuked. "There's no reason for Jean to have that kind of look. You're just over-analyzing. Why don't you go and see if your big brother wants to play then?" Amber looked up towards her for a second, the little cogs in her head whirling behind those bright eyes. Juniper pushed her up a moment later, watching as she rushed over to her sleeping son. His eyes opened slowly, one hand coming up to shield his face from the bright light, even as he grumbled against the inconsistent figure prodding and poking at his face. "Ruby, no." "Who's Ruby?" The question slammed into him, delivered by a voice that, while young, was definitely too young for his fellow leader and close friend. Instead, as he blinked away with heavy dust from his eyes and let out a long yawn, he found himself face to face with an altogether younger figure. "No one," he sighed, pushing himself a little further up against the tree. "What's up, brat? What do you want?" Amber, if you recalled, should be about 10, maybe 11 or 12, at a push. "I'm not a brat," the girl yelled, tiny hands on her waist as she towered over his slumped form. "I'm a princess, and you need to play with me." "Play? He? Jean Arc." "Maybe another time." His eyes began to drift shut once more, the great expanse of slumber calling out to him. A sigh escaped him a second later, fighting its way past the small figure, pushing against his cheek. "Amber," he complained. "Jean," she echoed, matching him tone for tone. "Knew there was a reason I hate kids." The girl cheered as he grunted and pushed himself up from the tree. His body still felt sluggish and unresponsive, a stark reminder of how weak at the moment. In fact, he still had his aura locked away. He was effectively a civilian. Have to do something about that later. I can force open myself, if I have to. Alright, he yawned, reaching out to place a hand on the girl's head so she'd stop hopping around. What do you want to play? What do you want to play? The question made him pause. What did he want to do? When was the last time he actually played at anything? When he wanted some fun, he'd, well, maybe spar with Pyrrha or Ruby, or go out to kill some Grimm with Nora, or he could talk to Yen and convince her to go into Vale with him, visit a club and get hammered, before inevitably ending the night by either metaphorically tearing up the dance floor or literally tearing it up. There was always doing homework with Ren or just catching some rest. But between all the fighting and trying to fulfill his duty, there hadn't exactly been a lot of time for childish games. Hide and seek, and nor was there now. Kurokomores might be missing for the next 2 days, but the moment it was back he would be gone. Until then he'd take advantage of what rest he could get, to prepare his body for the training to come. At least with this game Amber could run off to hide, and he could pretend to look for her until she got bored. That sounded promising. Okay, you count to 30, Amber giggled, reaching out to take his hand and push them over his eyes. And no peeking. 1, Jean started, rolling his eyes as he heard her scamper away. He didn't even bother to continue counting. Amber, don't go far, his mother called out. Even as the sound of her rushing through the nearby bushes reached his ears, lowering his hands, he leaned back with a short sigh, closing his eyes. Aren't you going to look for her? His mother's voice blocked any attempt to fall back into his pleasurable nap, grass shifting as she walked up to stand beside him. I hadn't intended to, he shrugged. Figure I'll give her 10 minutes before I look for her, let her have some fun. She hesitated. Rather you went for her now, actually. That caused one eye to crack open, regarding the older woman as her feet shuffled nervously in the grass beside him. A boy his age might not have been able to see the signs so easily, but it didn't require over 50 years of experience to see she was nervous about something. You think there might be Grimm around? The question seemed to startle her. What? No. A shake of her head. There's never been any Grimm this close. Why would you Never mind. It's just... Well, you know how she is. Normally I'd be fine with you all playing in the woods, but without Nikki, there's no one to find you all if you get lost. I could, he almost said, before catching himself. He could track any one of them through the woods if he needed to, but still, he could see her point. He was used to young girls being, well, like Ruby, independent, trained, able to look out for themselves. Amber, on the other hand, she was just a child. A child he'd encouraged to go run off alone in a forest she was hardly familiar with. There might be no Grimm, but there was still a host of accidents she could run into. I'll find her, he promised. Pushing against the grass as he climbed to his feet, Juniper seemed a little relieved, though not by a vast amount. She likely expected him to get into trouble too, which was a little galling. To be fair, he had been a bit useless back when it all started. His neck cracked as he moved it left and right, hand reaching to seek comfort in a familiar hilt, before realizing it wasn't there. Instead, he settled the belt around his waist, glancing at the bushes she'd run through, broken twigs, leaves crunched into the dirt. This was what he'd been relegated to? She could at least make it a challenge. Jean, are you? His mother spoke as he made to move by her, prompting a raised eyebrow from him. No. Never mind. She looked uncertain, with one hand clenched beneath her chin as she watched him. He thought about telling her it would be okay, that he'd have no difficulty finding her, but instead decided better. What reason would she have to trust him on that fact, when all her experience would have shown otherwise? She'd calmed down, he supposed, once he had Amber back safe. Looks like I'll be playing after all, he sighed, feeling no amusement in the thought. even as he pushed his way into the tree line, eyes scanning the floors for signs of her. They were abundant. The sun was high in the sky, and there'd be no rain for a day or two, it seemed, for the ground was hard and earthy, with a layer of dust and soil atop those patches where grass wouldn't grow. Even if he couldn't see her prints in those patches, he would have had to be blind to have missed the branches she had stepped on, that lay broken on the ground, or the wildflowers nearby, which had a suspicious parting in the middle, flowers poking to the left and right as though to make way for someone. He learned hunting, or at least the art of tracking, from the best. Ren might not have had the most in terms of stamina, but there was never any doubting his intelligence. He'd been an absolute machine when it came to stalking down his prey, or, as was more often the case, hunting Nora, which was an altogether more difficult task. "Amber," he called out, brushing the tall reeds and flowers aside as he followed her path. "Juniper wants us back with the others. Come out." He rolled his eyes with a sigh. "No, I'm not tricking you either. I'm serious." Jean let out a long sigh, shaking his head as he pushed on. Of course she wouldn't come out. That would be too easy. Do this the marginally less easy way then. He mused as he stepped over a rotten log, noticing how the moss atop it had been scuffed away. Animals wouldn't have done something like that. They preferred the path of least resistance, which would mean under, over, or around. It was only about 50 meters or so onto the tree line, where the tracks became more fresh, if they could be called that when less than a minute had passed. Broken twigs still wobbled back and forth, clinging grandly to their original branches, but, unmistakably, knocked aside. Strands of grass still looked to be springing back up, recently pushed down by a small child's gout. "Amber," he called again, cupping his hands around his mouth. "Come on out." A voice howled from his left, a shadow leaping for him. Jean knew the sound of a Beowulf, or the difference between one and an Ursa. In fact, he could identify most screams simply by the noise they made, or even the rhythm of their breathing. This was not a grim. He realized that the moment he heard it, but after years of being attacked by just about anyone, that knowledge did nothing to stop his hard-won instincts kicking in. He saw it happen in slow motion. His bright eyes grew wide. Before she could remove the expression of pure glee from her face, his forearm connected with her cheek, less than a second later, tearing the smile from her, even as she collapsed to her knees in shock. Jean could only stare in horror, first at her face and the red mark on her cheek, and then down at his hand, fist opening and closing slowly. Jean? Her voice cracked, light blue eyes sparkling with unshed tears as she looked up at him, in pain, distress, and fear. She tried to hold it in. He could see that, from the way her lip quivered and eyes watered. With one small hand clutching at her cheek, she looked down at the ground, blinking rapidly, before looking back up at him once more. He could see the confusion clear in her gaze. Why had her big brother hit her? Why had Jean hurt her? And he realized with a sudden bout of clarity that he had no idea what he was supposed to do. As she looked up at him like she was waiting, no, desperately hoping for something. Two small hands reached up towards him, asking for something. He couldn't figure out what it was, so he stood there, frozen, until with a choked gasp, the tears broke through the dam, the girl's hands boiling at her eyes as great sobs wrecked her body. "Do something," his mind cried as he watched her. His mind whirled, trying to recall those times he comforted others when they were in tears, but all he could bring up was memories of his friends. He could remember drinking with Nora, washing away their pain with alcohol and violence. Then there was standing behind Nora, offering silent comfort as she wept over the body of her childhood friend. Then there were the moments too with Pyrrha, of sharing a bed in an effort to seek comfort in a moment of transient pleasure. RWBY, staring down the body of her sister in muted shock as he stood nearby, one hand on her shoulder. As he knelt down before Amber, touched one hand to her sore cheek, he had no idea what he would do or how it would help, but the next thing he knew, she had thrown herself at him, burying her face in his chest. "I'm sorry," she cried into him, clenching at his shirt with both hands. I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And yet she apologized to him. After he hurt her, It was Amber who felt the need to apologize. That didn't make any sense. And why did she look so hurt still as she glanced up at him? He didn't know what he was supposed to do, arms slack at his sides as she waited for something. Was that what she wanted? He settled his hands on the back of her shoulder blades, drawing her close. Amber sniffled but pressed her face into his chest. She wanted a hug, to be held by her brother, a sign that he didn't hate her. It made a small amount of sense. When was the last time he'd been properly hugged by someone other than the brief touch of his mother that morning? If his memory served, it had been Ruby. She held onto him when they had buried Pyrrha. Not the last repeat, maybe one or was it 2 times before. It was my fault, he said softly to the child, as soft hair tickled his neck. Small and warm in his arms, in a way she reminded him of Ruby, except that, unlike his old friend, Amber would never know growing up with her older sibling, because time and time again, he would run away, leaving her behind. I'm really sorry. For everything. It's okay. She huffed and pushed herself away from him, trying to hide her red-rimmed eyes. It didn't even hurt. I'm a big girl. You are. He agreed, something heavy slipping from his shoulders as he held her close. The way she looked at him, despite her small denials and efforts to not say it, he could see nothing but unconditional love in her eyes. That hurt him more than the red mark on her face did, because he knew how much it would hurt her when he left. I'm sorry, Amber, but I need to save them. When this is all over, I promise I'll come back to spend more time with you. It was the best he could offer, because like it or not, he had to save his friends. They needed him at Beacon. It was his duty. I'm sorry for hurting you, he said once more, meaning more than she would ever realize. As he touched her cheek, a little sore judging from her wince, but thankfully his mind hadn't accounted for his gingerly younger body. He'd hit her with his forearm rather than the back of his hand, or a sword. The arcade, Amber whispered, looking up at him with sudden narrowed eyes. I want you to take me to the arcade tomorrow, to say sorry. He chuckled at her expression. What a scary little sister, to go from pain and sorrow to extorting him and so quickly. Her puppy dog face didn't have a chance against Ruby's, but he nodded nonetheless. His father wouldn't be back with Coeur for another day yet. He could afford to give up a single day's training to spend time with her, with the little girl that would soon have to grow up without him. Promise? A small smile like the morning sun rising on her face. I promise. Juniper let out a sigh of relief when the two appeared from the woodlands, the tension slipping from her shoulders at the sight of her youngest, balanced on the boy's shoulders. She seemed enthused, arms waving back and forth as he carried her back to them. Thank you, she mouthed at him, though she wasn't sure he caught it. For the rest of the afternoon she simply watched them all, as the 7 girls slowly drew John into their games. He indulged them. He indulged them all. A little woodenly at first, as though he wasn't quite sure of himself, but with an expression that said he would give in to any demand they asked of him. And her girls took wanton advantage of it. Maybe she thought to herself, finally losing that last bit of doubt, just maybe, everything would be okay after all.